Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate.
And then he said something about the darling buds of May, but don't worry, you don't have to know it.
'Cause you're listening to Eternal Light. Eternal Light.
Shakespeare for all.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Eternal Lines, a podcast project by the Shakespeare Company at UCLA. In today's episode, I am joined by Sylvia Abrams-Wolffsohn to talk through some of the goals of this podcast and then get down to business about why exactly Shakespeare is deemed eternal. I'm here with Sylvia Abrams-Wolffsohn.
Hello, my name is Sylvia Abrams-Wolffsohn. I've been working with Shakespeare Company since my freshman year, and I am now the social director of Shakespeare Company at UCLA.
Yeah. Alrighty. So first off, just what are our goals for Eternal Lines? I think the idea sort of started with we wanted to have a venue where we could have casual and informal discussions about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Because at least for me, like one of my favorite things is like being with like a couple other people and just getting to like nerd out about like, oh, that one line in that monologue, or oh, so-and-so in that show, like, oh, I love that. Those discussions that are like informal and casual.
Yeah, I think so much with Shakespeare, it's like, because there is so much like academia and scholarship and like anthropological work as well of like around Shakespeare that is like super, like if you're into that, is super cool and valuable, I think. But I think it gets turned into something that is only an academic conversation. And I think, especially like if you look back at what Shakespeare originally was, like when it was published was like, it was not academic in the slightest. Like the actors of Shakespeare were like deemed basically prostitutes. Like it wasn't a like highfalutin thing that has become this like very academic thing. And I think largely that's because there's so much to dive into, but it becomes this exclusionary, like put on a pedestal conversation that I think obscures a lot of the imperfections of Shakespeare and like the things that are worth like diving deeper into and having conversations about like what actually is going on here and like, do I agree with this? It gets turned into this thing that is like perfect and like can't be touched and is idealistic and like you have to be educated. I think that really personally takes away from like the enjoyment of Shakespeare and takes away from like what it can potentially be.
Yeah, I think we want to mess with it and we want to make it not stuffy and to your point also of like examine the parts of Shakespeare that are still awesome and still like affect us a lot and are like important artistically, and the parts of Shakespeare where we're like, that's outdated, that's from hundreds of years ago. Let's unpack why that's no longer relevant.
Exactly.
And furthermore, like, okay, then how do we change it or get rid of it? We don't need that part anymore.
Yeah, I think especially when you're talking about like we want to mess with it, I think that goes into the conversation of like Shakespeare has become this like almost propaganda tool. And actually in some instances like around like globally, England used Shakespeare as this propaganda of their superiority, and they used it as like a colonial tool of like this like high bar to get to. And like I think I have a personal belief that like art is created like with and by the audience or by the reader. Like art, like even if you are the writer of a piece of text, stories are informed by those who read them or who perceived them. And so like you can read, like, yes, there's like the text that we are given that like was written by Shakespeare or the the group of actors that like put together their scripts, or like the public. There is also so much ambiguity around like where these texts came from. Like it's not like the word of God. It's not like there's like it's not like there was like copyright in those days.
Yeah.
So like there is ambiguity around that, which I think is so interesting and gives us permission to mess with it and to like turn it into what we see in it. And I think that's what I like to do with art. And I think with this podcast, I think one of the goals, Violet, you had mentioned when we first started talking about this, was to bring in other voices. Is a space with Shakespeare especially, there are so many voices that are, like, from the get-go excluded from the conversation because it's put on this pedestal and told, like, this is what it is. Like, Shakespeare wrote it that way, and, like, if you're not getting this out of your reading, then you're reading it wrong.
And if you don't, like, understand this intellectually, then you can't like it at all. Or if you don't know, like, these 4 techniques about how to deal with it, then you can't touch it.
Yeah, and, like, the idea of, like, if you can't understand it intellectually is, like, that phrase is, like, used to describe a very specific and, like, niche way of engaging with Shakespeare intellectually that has been formed over the years, especially in, like, a Western, I mean, it comes from England, it comes from a Western, like, history, but, like, it comes from a very particular viewpoint of, like, white men talking about Shakespeare. Like, privileged white men talking about Shakespeare who have education and money, and these are the people who are allowed to, quote-unquote, like, dictate what Shakespeare wanted. When in reality, like, you don't know it all.
You don't need that to be able to read a thing and go, that's cool, and here's why I think that's cool.
Yeah.
And another goal of ours, I think, in this is we just wanted to, like, especially in this time when we're all kind of exploring how we can do theater digitally, we wanted to find ways to produce more content for Shakespeare Company that people can be interacting with and consuming. And this is cool because it's on a smaller scale. So we have the potential to have, like, more intimate conversations one-on-one with people, and for, like, it's like, half an hour, so it's not all that, like, it's not gonna take your whole quarter, but it's something that, like, like so many different people can come and contribute to in some way.
Yeah, I think, like, from my experience, like, the goal of working with Shakespeare Company, like, I think the goal of Shakespeare Company at its core is to connect with community and to build community, whether that be within, like, TFT, where we all where so many of us come from, of, like, if you're already involved in theater and the arts, or whether that be with, like, South Campus majors or literally whoever, like, we just want to connect to people. And I think in the time of coronavirus, at this current moment, like, it's really difficult to build community. Like, it's one thing to hold on to community, but I think it's another thing to build community through the current moment. And I think that's something that Shakespeare Company is dedicated to doing. And this is one of the ways that Violet came up with, of, like, it's really hard to get yourself to, like, go to that Zoom meeting of, like, that dance class that you wanted to do, or, like, that play you were wanting to, like, watch the live stream of. Like, I know that for me personally, there are so many things that I have wanted to engage with community-wise, but the idea of, like, getting on a Zoom call and, like, or committing, like, a bunch of time to it has been kind of difficult recently because of the whole pandemic thing.
And hopefully, this is half an hour.
This is for us, we wanted it to be, like, a simple way of, like, low barrier to entry, like, make community building simpler.
Yeah, and so moving forward, too, I have my own, like, episode idea list and stuff, but I am also hoping to kind of crowdsource of, like, what are things that just people in the theater community and in the Shakespeare Company community, what are things other people want to talk about?
And in the, like, UCLA community.
Yeah. And furthermore, like, obviously, like, I have the people that, like, I know will nerd out about Shakespeare with me, but I'm hoping to kind of broaden that scope in terms of who we invite on the show.
Yeah.
To more people from all over UCLA.
Yeah. Like, build the network of folks that we're connected to.
Yes. So look out for more opportunities for episode ideas to get put on the show, and also for episode ideas I already have, but we need guests for. Like, some I'll say, hey, we want to talk about Taming of the Shrew in one of our next episodes. Who wants to talk about Taming the Shrew with me for half an hour? And then we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And, like, I know we have discussed and have a couple ideas in the works of, like, social media outreach in terms of like posting on our stories, of like asking for topic ideas or your listeners' opinions on why Shakespeare, or different questions that might come up in our episodes or in our discussions. So follow us on Instagram at Bruin Bard, and also Facebook. I believe it's Shakespeare Company at UCLA. I know there's a bit of confusion. We're both of those things.
Yes.
We are both Shakespeare Company at UCLA and Bruin Bard.
Yes.
So follow us there to be a part of conversation.
Yeah.
Eternal Lines is a podcast project created by the Shakespeare Company at UCLA, hosted by Violet Morris, with intro music produced by Kay Sybil, with a little bit of help from Jacob Cherry, and all sound design and editing done by the illustrious Elizabeth Smith. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, so now we can sort of shift gears to talk about the question of the hour, which is, okay, our podcast is called Eternal Lines, which implies that Shakespeare is eternal. So why do we feel like it is eternal? And furthermore, to break that question down of like, why are we still doing Shakespeare in 2020? And why is it something that we're getting excited about?
Yeah, and then for those of you who don't know, the phrase eternal lines comes from Sonnet 18, which is the famous "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" The last couplet is, "But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee."
I love that. I love in the sonnets how there's this running theme of you're going to die eventually, like his lover, like you're gonna die, but you'll still live on because I wrote about you.
Yeah.
And I think that ties into why I kind of feel like Shakespeare is still relevant, of like these big feelings in it are like still living in that text and living in that poetry. And I get sucked in by the words of it. And by how words are both like super effective and
Never enough.
like never enough. Like language never truly captures what we want to say, even though this language is so verbose and so complicated.
Yeah. And so
but
emotional.
It never gets it.
Yeah, it never gets across exactly what you want to say, and I think that's like acknowledged in the text. I think like, and whether or not Shakespeare intended it, you can never know, because of the whole thing of like the dude is dead, you can't talk to him. I think what you mentioned of like there's so much emotion in it, and I think like whoever Shakespeare was, I think it's the fact that like when you read it, like you can tell that like whoever it was and however many people put into it, but like whoever wrote these words and these lines and these stories like put so much of themselves into these lines. And like I think that it's so apparent reading it that like there is a person in these words, and it's a person who loves deeply and like thinks deeply and feels everything, and like is so human. Is something that is apparent in Shakespeare, and it's something that's apparent in like so many other texts. Like by saying this, I by no means mean that like Shakespeare is the only as Shakespeare is the best. Like there are so many other plays and texts and stories that like
That
I feel that in, and I think that's the reason why we as humans tell stories, is to communicate like how human we are. And
Absolutely.
I think Shakespeare is one example of that.
And I think another, like, to your point from earlier, another reason why, like, people have been holding on to Shakespeare for so long is this idea of, like it represents a certain level of, like, intellectual elitism.
That's interesting. That's an interesting thought. I think part of the reason that it has become quote-unquote eternal is because, like, a group of people, a very powerful group of people, basically, like, forced it to be. And I think another way to look at it is, like, okay, how can we use Shakespeare as a tool of understanding systems of oppression? Like, here is a piece of text that was in many ways historically used as a system of oppression, and it's still widely understood and widely resonated with and widely, like, discussed, and it means a lot to a lot of people. So, like, what's going on? Like, what's going on? How can something be at the same time so violent and so harmful and so meaningful and healing to so many people? And I think human. Yeah, and so human. I think why I'm drawn to Shakespeare is because it contains all of that.
Yeah.
And I think that doesn't mean I shouldn't criticize it. I think that is, like, part of why I should think about it critically and criticize it and seek to understand what's going on. Where did people take certain ideas and how were they used with ill intent or for power or for harm? And how has Shakespeare been used in other senses for connection and love and community and joy? Like, how, like, where is that all coming from?
And I think the fact that these stories are so well known and, like, so ingrained in our Western canon, I think it, like, as we venture forward, I think it actually, like, is kind of useful, the fact that, like, people know these stories, because the fact that people know Romeo and Juliet, that means that, like, you have more freedom to interpret the text in different ways and mess with the text a little bit more, because it's a story that people already know. Like, people already know about Macbeth. So if you throw Macbeth on its head and you change certain things, and like last year Shakespeare Company doing Macbeth with a female Macbeth, like, if you, like, the fact that the story itself is already well known, it opens up opportunities for so many different interpretations.
Yeah,
and
further, deeper exploration.
Yeah. Like, like us doing Bowie Tempest, like, that was, like, if you, probably in 16 something, whenever he wrote The Tempest, he was not thinking you're going to do a David Bowie version in 2019, but you can, because it's hundreds of years later, and, like, we already know the story, so adding another layer onto it isn't jarring or confusing for the audience.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with, like, fairy tales, like Cinderella.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that's so ingrained in our in our cultural consciousness that, like, you don't have to expend the energy in your storytelling to make sure that the audience understands the story.
Yeah, understands
because
that part of the story.
To a certain extent, and that's not true with all of Shakespeare's plays.
Yes.
Like, if you look at the histories,
like, no one knows
less well-known
King John
productions, then it's a different conversation. But with the very popular, at least in these times, plays,
like, yeah, there's the Hilary Duff Cinderella movie, and there's the Selena Gomez Cinderella movie, and we love it because we already know these stories, but now it's like, oh, but there's a new twist. In this one, she's a dancer, and in this one, it's her. Yeah, this happens
because these stories are so well known. There's an opportunity to delve even further into them, of, like, explore, like, what is the capacity of these stories? How much can this story hold? How many different perspectives and realities and interpretations can this individual story hold? And I think that's something that I love about theater, is that it invites you, because just the nature of a play, like, someone writes a play to be produced over and over and over and over again. You don't write a play to have it produced once and then never again.
Yeah. I mean, some person might, but usually that's not the case.
Typically, like, you write a play so that it can be in the public consciousness, that people can come back to it and produce it in different places. In a sense that's different from, like, film. Like, you write a movie to create one movie, and that's the movie.
Yeah, and I think also in terms of writing plays to add to the canon, I think also Shakespeare Company, in recent years, we've been expanding our new works program, like, because I think that is, like, was just such a good move to start that up as a company that, like, as a company that's all about classical theater, being active in the acknowledgement of, like, we are still doing this old stuff because there's still more here, and there's still more to play with, and there's still more exploration to be had within these old texts. While at the same time, we're pushing new theater and new playwrights and new ideas. I'm just like, I love it.
That are continuing to contribute into this historical canon of stories to be, like, continued to delve into and explore and interpret. I think theater is a historical, ancient practice from every culture. Like, Shakespeare's plays are written, like, the stories, the original, like, the plots are taken from, like, old stories that were popular in his time.
Oh yeah, he stole all kinds of stuff.
All of his best plays, he did not write the plot. Like, he took the plot and then wrote a story around it. The plot of some, like, myth or legend or historical thing that happened. He took those stories and then adapted them. And, like, it's this process of acknowledging the old while creating something new. And I think Shakespeare and the acknowledgement of classical works invites us to also acknowledge, like, what is happening right now.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I keep coming back to Shakespeare because I'm still finding new ways that it's relevant to, like, my life right now. And I wonder if you could touch on that in terms of, like, Richard, and in terms of how working on that show during 2020 and what that was like in terms of, like, how that was relevant to what's going on in the world right now.
Definitely. I directed Richard III for the Shakespeare Company during the spring quarter 2020. I had planned to direct it, obviously, for the stage. I had proposed it, like, the summer before. And I had this whole vaudeville-themed thing going on that I had planned. And then the pandemic happened, and, like, all of our classes were canceled, and we were going to spring break, and Isabel Smith, who's our New Works director, she was like, why don't we do them as radio plays? And so it was like, cool, we're doing radio plays now. And I think that experience of having to adapt so quickly took away so much of, like, what we knew about theater and forced us to, like, look at, like, okay, like, our stage is gone, our company is gone, like, our costumes, props, like, lighting, like, all sets, all of the visual is all gone, and all we have is the text. We have the text and our voices, and then sound design as well. And so what do we do with that? Is there a reason to keep coming back to this text if all we have is the text? Was really the question. And I think what I found there is it forced me to look deeper into what the story had to say, what I could find and relate to in the story. And in this moment in time. And at that moment, I was feeling a lot of grief and a lot of loneliness and a lot of frustration with systems of power and individuals in power who were being, like, awful. And I was sitting with Richard III, and I couldn't help but see what I was going through. And, like, maybe that's because I was looking for something to project my experience on. Maybe I was looking for a way to process my own feelings and emotions along with my cast. And I think that's probably true. And I think that is, like, why we do theater. We do theater to understand ourselves and our world. And I think doing Richard III specifically during a global pandemic and then releasing it, by coincidence, our release date was a week or so after the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings and protests that came after that. And we really had to sit with the question of, like, is this appropriate right now? Like, is this needed? Like, why are we doing this? And that was a question I really had to sit and ask myself and my cast and my crew and Shakespeare Company and my community outside of that. I had lots of conversations with my family and members of TFT. I talked to Dominic Taylor. I talked to friends. And I think what I came to was, like, I don't know if this is the right time. Like, I don't know how this will be received. I do know that this was a work that helped me process grief. This was a work that helped me connect to community and gave me an opportunity, me and I know my castmates as well, gave me an opportunity to reflect and think deeply about systems of power and how those systems of power affect individuals. Especially Richard III, for me, was a play about the women. It was a play about all of the people that Richard harmed in his grab for power, in his, like, incessant need to dominate. For me, doing that play, I felt drawn to the women and drawn to the people who were affected by him and affected by that grab for power. And like, it was just as much, if not more, their stories than his. Because at the end of the play, he is gone, and really all you're left with is the people who had to endure that power struggle. Yeah. The question you asked me was like, what was it like directing Shakespeare at this time? It was incredibly confusing, incredibly testing and difficult, and made me really, really deeply question why I was doing this. I think like every day I came to rehearsal, and every week I had to keep asking myself, like, is this really worth it? Because it was a lot of work. It was an incredible amount of work, not only for me, but for my cast and my crew and for our community. It was an incredibly taxing experience, as any piece of theater is. But in this moment of, like, everything seems so awful and so painful and so difficult and so confusing and scary, you know, how y'all lived through it the past few months. Like, it was so much to deal with. Like, Richard III and having that community and that conversation and that text to come back to gave me something to ground in. Yeah. It gave me something to think about that wasn't like my impending doom or perceived impending doom of the world. And it gave me something solid to hold on to of like community and people and characters and stories. And ultimately, even in that horrible, like, twisted, like, messed up play where there's so much pain and so much suffering after such a long period of time, because Richard III is the last of Shakespeare's histories of the story of the War of the Roses. It's the end of the War of the Roses, of this like 6-play long like story, and it's this exhaustion, this story of people who have had to endure so much grief. And it gave me something to search for hope in that was easier and more tangible than my outer world.
I think having to grapple, like, in the time of COVID, I think having to grapple with, like, we're still on this, like, at least, like, for me and you and for theater makers in general, like, we're still on this path of pursuing art, but it's, like, the questions that are coming up of, like, my whole career revolves around a live audience, so what's gonna happen, and like what's going on, and having to keep coming back to, like, why does doing what I'm doing and why does theater and why does art matter right now in a time where, like, the normal avenues of pursuing it are blocked. And I think in Richard of, like, coming back to the question of like why am I doing this right now, why is it important, I think creating art where we're really active in exploring the why and really active in continuing to, like, reaffirm this is important right now, and this makes me feel something, and this is something that I, like, am excited about and want to do and want to see flourish. Being active in that, in the expression of that, I think makes any art that you do so much stronger. And I definitely felt that way in Richard, of, like, being confronted with the questions of, like is this an important thing to be doing right now in the world, and then saying, yes, it is. This is what I can be doing. This is, like, something that I care about, that I want to be doing. Having to continually reaffirm that, it felt like it made the work all the more powerful. Yeah.
I think something that I've come back to when thinking about, like, why do we do theater, why do we create art, is, like, it is for at least from my perspective, like, it's for the production of, we're searching for joy and hope and, like connection. Because I think so often we're rooted in the need for survival, and that is so, so important. And I think art is the acknowledgement that joy and connection and love and all of those things are essential to our survival.
And with that, we will wrap up our episode for today. Thank you, Sylvia, for joining me, and thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in. I hope everyone is doing well, and we'll see you next time.